Good evening, all. I'm Natalia, Conference Director at the 100 Conferences. I hope you have been enjoying our session so far and that you already made some valuable connections in here. I'm pleased to introduce our next guest, John Edge, who has been operating in capital markets for many years. And as a venture specialist, he also went through the grief cycle of COVID-19. Please take a chance to ask our keynote speaker questions. John will answer them during the Q&A. So without any further ado, John, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Well, to everybody, thank you for spending time today listening. This is one of the more random ways to do a keynote. You get no audience interaction. And I always hold an opinion that it's fortunate that I get to be the one talking. However, it's clear if we look through all the attendees today that we all have similar backgrounds and experiences. And so I'd really advocate for an interaction. My objective from this session is to stimulate conversation around the impacts to us as individuals and as businesses and society of COVID, especially in the context of something that I was educated on maybe 3 months ago, and this of the grief cycle. I'm going to pop up a presentation now to talk through. I'm going to look to talk for about 5 to 8 minutes, and then hopefully have some good interaction. So let me check that I can get the technology working. And there we go. Right. So around the world, there is a lack of permission from policy leaders and public health for us to gather together as friends and strangers. I'm clearly British. I'm based in the US. The UK is having a tough time, and so are many other countries. And this lack of permission is what's driving our economic and social challenges. Quick blurb on the Oxford Internet Institute. One of the benefits of Oxford is it's multidisciplinary. This isn't a plug. I'm a background in capital markets. I happen to be a fellow at Oxford and MIT. What I find really interesting there is the breadth of thinking on different topics around how we create systems change. And on this point, something I say probably 5 times a day is that we have a plan that's between 650 and 2,000 years old called quarantine, where a biological threat gets out and we shut everything down until it goes away. It is our opinion that we need to invent a new systems response for dealing with a pandemic, because unfortunately, this is unlikely to be the last one that we have to deal with in our lifetime. So when I have conversations with people in the context of COVID and how it impacts investment decisions and operating models, a lot of talk goes to the technology or to the businesses. But really, if we can't change policy, we aren't going to be changing industry, and we're not going to be changing growth. And the policy of how we deal with this pandemic is crucial, and how we all shape it is a very active role. If we think about a major investor with tens of billions of dollars investments, if that investor says, you know what, we're not investing in fossil fuels, that changes the policy in relation to climate change. So we have a role to play in capital formation and investment around the shaping of policy for the response to COVID. I'd set this up now to say we're obviously, and again, this is an America's image. I could spin this around and do the rest of the world. We're in a pretty dark spot, save the reported numbers out of China this week on the 4% GDP growth. I want to highlight today, and if there's one thing I'd like people to remember from today's conversation, is what problem are we facing? We are specifically facing a problem around human beings and when they're in a transmission state. If you're not in a transmission state, you should be out at work generating GDP, at school learning. And so the question is how do we have a operating model for our societies that takes this into account? We will read in months and years to come around the initial response of quarantine, and then the initial response of limited testing that detected people outside of transmission phases, and how we eventually moved to a plan of understanding who is transmitting the virus and how that impacted operating models. So that key point of we cannot open our economies unless we understand what health state people are in feeds into a COVID literate operating model. This phrase is something that we like to use every day, looking at our businesses that we operate or have investments in COVID literate. Obviously, there's a wealth of information on the internet. What's fascinating is this focus on portfolio management. So if we're doing portfolio management in the context of COVID, do the operating businesses have a COVID literate operating model? And within that COVID literate operating model, are the businesses in track with the latest thinking or thesis on how to be literate? And this really gets to sort of the meat and potatoes of this talk, which is what mindset are we on? I was brought up to speed on COVID in January by a phone call out of Wuhan from somebody in my network that lives there. And he said to me, 400,000 Chinese are going to die from this virus, and it's coming your way. I specifically remember speaking to my wife that night and saying there's something coming. By February, we'd readjusted our portfolios, and we're now starting to plan what was about to arrive. I would say that I went through the denial piece in January. The anger bit was probably February. I spent March and April trying to find a way around it. By June was a rough month, because you're looking at the magnitude of what's about to happen. And I would say that the conversations we had in June with public companies in exposed businesses for a COVID literate operating model, think airlines, a number of those conversations were, it's going to go away this summer. It won't impact our business. So that was big decisions being made in a denial state in June, which have people now coming back to the table for conversations in a bargaining state. And that has not even started to get to the point of the depression phase of, oh my word, how expensive is this going to be? How are we going to deal with it? We can't deal with what we're going to do. I would love to know, I would love to do a straw poll of all the people on this keynote talk today, what state's everybody at? I know a lot of people are still in the angry state. Very few people I know have accepted the reality, where we are. And if you break out the Kubler-Ross into an extra few stages, the test and accept, I'd say, is where I am today. Looking at the portfolio of businesses, looking at the operating model and testing realistic solutions in the context of what we're facing, in the context of the public policy initiatives around the world. I don't think I have to point out the frickin' obvious that the impact is everywhere. What I do think from a portfolio company point of view and from an investment thesis point of view is what are the key roles and key functions that will have to come into play to enable these industries and areas to generate the returns or growth required to support the capital needs. I lean in here to the operating areas that that we look at, and I want to tie it back to that initial thing that, you know, the majority of people that I'm speaking to at the moment are focused on portfolio management. I'm going to pause here because I've got 5 minutes left and go to questions. So I'm going to stop sharing. Now this is interesting. So I pick up on the, you know, the no questions so far. You know, if anybody listening, and this is the hard part, because if I was in a theater, I'd pick somebody out and ask them to answer a question. So I'd ask a question. Does anybody out there seen a business deploy a COVID literate operating model? Here we go. Now, I'm going to keep an eye on time here, and I can talk about, in the absence of questions, I can talk about what I'm seeing in the market. In anything to do with an event space, people are now starting to say, how do we fund the ability to test our clients, our spectators, like the NBA bubble did with the players, in order to get people back into stadiums. I think we're going to see this for every place in the world where people need to get into a physical place. So an airplane, a stadium, a food processing plant. Great, Brian, gate one. Well, that's, you know, I'm actively looking as part of our policy work at who's doing this. How do you help? So Brian, I'd love to catch up with you afterwards. In terms of help business, what's fascinating to me is we invariably end up in a room with a small number of people, and just, you know, from a demographics point of view, it's invariably male and invariably, you know, age 40 to 60, and the reactions are generally, we're just going to wait, and, you know, this thing will go away. I'm going to say that, you know, and it might be a question for, you know, we'd love to sort of spar with somebody like Brian to say, now, how many people are ready to accept that it's changed? So I use this Kubler-Ross presentation all the time to say, where are you? You know, if we're not at the acceptance stage, then we have to spend a lot of time saying, which stage are you at? You know, are you angry? Are you angry that you have to change your business? Are you angry that there's an extra cost? So a lot of the time, to answer the question, in helping businesses move along, is spent on this grief cycle, which is why I chose to present on it today. Because I don't think until we understand where decision makers are in that cycle, we can actually get decisions done. So with an eye on time, I think I'm on time here. Natalia. By the way, if anybody does this kind of presentation, it's a very strange new way of doing keynotes.
Yes, I agree with you, John. But you made some really interesting points, and I believe that everyone will agree with me when I say that it's an insightful presentation regarding the 7 stages of grief cycle. So it was a pleasure to host you at our conference. There is one more panel discussion ahead, so you can stay with us and learn more about the deal sourcing.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you too, and yeah, enjoy the rest of our sessions. Bye.
Bye.